You're in your little space shuttle.
Yeah, it's so good here. This is my attic where I hang out.
Good audio. Gotta love those dampened spaces. I've discovered a newfound love for carpet since I've become a podcast host.
Wow. Yeah.
Does very well. Are you coming from Boston?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
Nice.
right outside of Boston in a place called Belmont.
Cool.
Right.
Well, we'll get right in this. I want to be super respectful of your time. I just want to give you a quick background on me before we get in it. As I mentioned, I don't know if you got the email. I was talking to Chris Ryan and Jim Fadiman, who are
Hmm.
good buddies of mine, who both say hello and a big
Oh,
hug
good.
to you.
Good.
So I have a background in environmental journalism and documentary film. Over the last couple of years, I fell into the world of podcasting and became really good friends with Chris Ryan, who has his own very popular podcast. We together co-created a satirical awards show, uh, which was named, pardon the French, but it was named the Motherfucker Awards, where we celebrated corporations that screwed Mother Earth. And it was a whole satirical awards show where we got journalists like Matt Taibbi to present awards to banks like JP Morgan Chase. And then we got famous comedians to go up as the CEOs, as fictitious CEOs of these corporations and give acceptance speeches on their behalf. So I have a background in journalism and then activism, and just recently became the editor in chief at MUD WTR, because it's one of the good guys out there telling stories that we think are important. So I'm really happy to be here with you. I'm super familiar with your work, and that's a bit about me. I'm an avid surfer as well.
Oh, great, Kyle. That sounds wonderful.
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
tried surfing just a few times, and it's not that easy to learn.
yeah. No, I wrote an article once about psychedelics and said that psychedelics are a lot like learning to surf. If you have an instructor and you go out in small seas, it's a relatively safe experience. But if you go out on a huge swell by yourself, that's kind of on you. And most people don't treat surfing or psychedelics with the same respect that they deserve.
That's a good comparison.
Yeah. Well, let's get right into it. I wanted to start off with asking you about this quote, um, and see what it means to you and how it's informed your life. And the quote is: "Who believes that the law is unjust and breaks it willingly, suffering the consequences to be an example for others, actually has the highest regard for the law." Martin Luther King. What does that quote mean to you, and how has it informed your life?
Well, it means a lot to me, and there's two different ways that it means things to me. First off, I was a Vietnam War draft resistor. And so I spent a lot of time trying to think about how I would respond to the draft. And, I turned 18 in 1971. So I was near the end of the lottery. And there were a lot of different ways that people were objecting to the draft. Some were, getting their draft cards and burning their draft cards. Some were running away to Canada. Some were pretending to be crazy. Some were pretending to be gay. All the different things that people do. Some people shot themselves in the foot. Some people pretended to have bone spurs. People did all sorts of things like that. So I studied a lot of nonviolent resistance: Gandhi, Tolstoy, Martin Luther King, Thoreau, just a whole lot. And so, what that quote means to me is that better than running away, but what I ended up, my strategy was to figure out how to drain the most energy from the system and to be willing to go to jail. So, I purposely chose that I would be open to going to jail. And by draining the most energy of from the system, that led to the conclusion that I should not even register for the draft. That the very first step where you collaborate is that you make it easier for them because you put your name on a list. Now, I was paying taxes. I had a social security number. I was in high school. I just assumed that they had my birth date, that I would be caught. And as it turned out, the strategy was the best possible one I could have chosen in a way, because absolutely nothing happened for not registering for the draft. And so, but that led me when I was 18 at that time to decide to be an underground psychedelic therapist and go through my own psychedelic psychotherapy, because my father was saying he didn't want me to go to Vietnam. He was supportive of my willingness to go to jail, but he said, you're going to be a felon. You're never going to be able to have a career that involves a license because you will be disqualified. And I was like, okay, that's a price I'm going to have to pay. I'm not willing to go to Vietnam in order to get a certain kinds of job. And then I thought, aha, I can be an underground psychedelic therapist. You don't need a license for that. So that quote has been fundamentally important to me in my early on strategy. And at that time, I identified as, counterculture, drug using criminal, because not just because of the drug law, but also because I was thinking to go to jail. The second thing that's really surprised me about this particular quote from Martin Luther King was something that I didn't learn about for almost another 15 years. And that's when I decided to do, for my new college, a senior thesis doing a long-term follow-up to the Good Friday experiment. So the Good Friday experiment was done by Timothy Leary, Walter Pankey in 1962, this tremendous experiment about whether psychedelics could produce religious experiences. And it took 20 divinity students from Andover Newton Theological Seminary into Boston University Chapel. And it was a Harvard PhD. And they went through a Good Friday experiment, and all of them got a pill. Half was placebo, half was nicotinic acid. And the minister was Reverend Howard Thurman, who was this incredibly dynamic Black minister. And it turned out that Howard Thurman had been Martin Luther King's mentor when Martin Luther King got a PhD at Boston University. And also Howard Thurman had spent time with Gandhi. And he was one of the principal advisors for the nonviolent resistance strategy of the civil rights workers. So we hear a lot about John Lewis and Bloody Sunday, and a lot of these people learned from Reverend Howard Thurman about this nonviolent approach. And I think that's what really helped them make a lot of progress. So when I went to the Marsh Chapel, just to see, now this is in the middle 80s, to just see where the Good Friday experiment took place, there's a statue, an art exhibit, sort of a statue in front of the Marsh Chapel dedicated to Martin Luther King. And on the side of that statue is that quote from Martin Luther King. So it was an inspiration for me when I was younger to help me, decide to be a draft resistor. And then later on, as I'm doing psychedelics and got into that, there's that same quote again. And then the connecting link is Howard Thurman, who was Martin Luther King's advisor. So I do think that we have to have our own internal morality, and that we can't rely on the outside laws to provide that. They can be guidance, but we have to have our own internal moral compass. And a lot of times things that are legal are immoral. Voter suppression, and a lot of the Nazis made, quote, legal laws. We have all sorts of laws that are immoral. So anyway, I wonder how it is that you decided to ask that question about that quote.
It was by total chance. I had no idea that you even knew about the quote.
Really?
No,
oh,
I
okay. See, I'm pretty gullible.
No, I heard that it was an important quote in your life.
Yeah.
Given your involvement in the 1960s, there's the civil rights movement. There is the women's rights movement, environmental movement. Like there's this real shift in consciousness. And a lot of people would argue that the environmental movement, specifically, was the result of the psychedelic movement. What parallels do you see from the 1960s to today, when we have Black Lives Matter, this new renaissance in psychedelic studies? What do you see as parallels, as well as places that are different in your mind, having lived through both periods?
Yes. So I do believe that a lot of the motivation that people got for working in the environmental movement, for even civil rights, women's rights, anti-Vietnam War, we see this from the Beatles and all, was their psychedelic experiences, which I think don't always, but can enable people to have this transcendence of the ego, this sense of connection, this unity, this, so we're all in it together. Same thing that the astronauts get from going up to space and looking back down, the overlook or the overview effect they call it. You see that we're all one planet. You can feel that about all the universe. This it's all one thing. It's all this energy, all interconnected. It's all in motion. And so I do think that a lot of the impetus for some of the challenging of the status quo in the 60s came from and was inspired by people's psychedelic experiences. We're, I think, at a very dynamic time in world history right now, where the environmental crisis is worse than it's ever been. We see a rise of racism, nationalism, authoritarianism. There's a lot of parallels between the eras. What I would say, though, is the differences is that when the psychedelic research and sort of broadening use of psychedelics in society really happened in the 60s, the culture was just emerging from World War II and the 50s, and it was really much more resistant to kind of the insights of the psychedelic experience. So to continue on this discussion about the Beatles, they bring Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who was the one that invented or developed transcendental meditation. So you get these guys in robes from India that come over to teach meditation, and there was just an enormous resistance. These are weird, strange people, and meditation itself was not as widely appreciated. Now we have mindfulness, and you go everywhere we talk about mindfulness, but at the time, really meditation was kind of a new thing. Yoga even was a new thing in widespread sort of popular awareness, and people were saying that if you do yoga, you're going to be becoming a Hindu or some other religion. It's going to be bad for you. It's a threat to Christianity and to American Judeo-Christian thing to do yoga. Also, in the 60s, death was something that was much suppressed. People didn't talk about it. If you had cancer, people hid it from other people. The first hospice wasn't until 1974. So this idea of death and ego death and death rebirth cycles, that was challenging to the society. Birth at the time, women were tranquilized. Men were not allowed in the delivery room. We've since changed our attitudes towards birth, towards death, towards yoga, towards meditation, towards mysticism. So the culture has evolved. Also, if you look at art and media, there's so much psychedelic imagery that you see all the time, this sort of going into these sort of wormholes and tunnels and all this kind of stuff that you can have the inner visuals when you're on psychedelics. That has now become part of art and movies in our culture. So I think that the crises are in some ways, arguably greater. At the time in the 60s, we just had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so it was also the height of the Cold War, and we had the potential of nuclear annihilation, which we're not that far away from now. We still have that potential, but people don't worry about it as much. But I think that we are arguably at even a more crisis place. It's clear that humanity's trajectory is towards destruction of the environment, and the globalization is bringing people together, but some people are seeing that, other people are retreating from that into fundamentalism and authoritarianism. So I do think that for those reasons that the society is better prepared, and whether the need is as great or greater now than before, that we have a much better chance to succeed in the integration of psychedelics into culture now than before. And the fundamental thing that's different is that we're not self-identifying as a counterculture. the psychedelic community was a counterculture, and it was, let's go back to the land and let's build these communes and let's, leave, turn on, tune in, drop out. Now we're talking about mainstreaming psychedelics, and we have for-profit psychedelic companies traded on the stock exchanges where we didn't have before. So I'm very hopeful about the potential to succeed in integrating psychedelics into culture, at the same time that I'm more concerned about the dangerous situation that we're in.
In the 1960s, you had intellectuals like Noam Chomsky that were speaking truth to power. You had the Beatles, who were kind of making it irresistible for even hardline, 1950s people. He was making it irresistible for them to get involved. It seemed a real intellectual renaissance as a weapon of love and unity. Do you see that today? And I'll kind of underscore it with this point, because do you worry at all about anti-intellectualism today as a possible real threat to the movement?
Oh my God. So let's talk about QAnon, and let's talk about election fantasies about Trump winning the election, or about the denial of the dangers of the COVID, or even about climate change denialism. So we are on the verge of this massive denial of reality and irrationality, and people being motivated by irrational factors, tribalism and irrational factors. So I think that's tremendously dangerous right now. And we just saw an insurrection on the Capitol just a few minutes ago. Trump got impeached for the second time for stirring up on the basis of irrational lies and getting people to not think logically. So I think we have an enormous crisis of people being motivated by irrational factors and not thinking logically. And these irrational factors, humans are actually, you could say, kind of a thin veneer of rationality over these irrational parts of our history that have taken us, tens of thousands of years. And so that it's a dangerous situation. And humanity itself, as the way that we process ideas, the way that our irrational factors are so important, that could destroy us, destroy the world, destroy democracy. So I'd say that that's the biggest factor. So, and that's where we get into psychedelics and our goal of mass mental health, because a lot of these people are operating the fear and the anxiety. You could say the reptilian brain is overwhelming their rationality, because their world is dissipating. Even before COVID, what we heard was that around half of Americans could not handle a $500 emergency expense. So if you can imagine what it's like to live under that kind of stress and pressure, and we've had these exaggerated views of libertarianism, of freedom, that have made it so the collective safety net, in many cases doesn't exist. Look at the whole effort of the Republicans to trash the Affordable Care Act. It wasn't that they were going to give us a better healthcare system. Trump's never proposed a better system. So we have both people living on the edge, culture changing, jobs changing, and a lot of these same people, but other people as well, trying to eliminate the social safety net. So when people are on that edge of anxiety, they are prey to irrational factors. And so we could go back to Abraham Maslow and humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology. A lot of people in their psychology classes, even in high school, have learned about the hierarchy of needs that's shown as this pyramid. And you've got your survival needs and your, and it moves up and up and up your needs for self-esteem, for belonging, for purpose and meaning. And then it's a lot of people think about it as self-actualization. is the top. And that was true up until the last few years of Abraham Maslow's life, where he started encountering psychedelic research and other people with non-ordinary states of consciousness research. And so it turned out that he modified this hierarchy of needs to, at the top is now above self-actualization is self-transcendence. So it's moving to, you could say, this bodhisattva kind of thing, that you are there to help others. So all of this is just to say that when your base survival needs are not met, it's harder for you to pay attention to these other needs. And so we now have a lot of people that are economically dislocated, even more now because of COVID. And it's out of that sense of a lack of vision for their future, or a vision for their future of their children, that people are able to be motivated by irrational factors. And that's a tremendous danger.
I was reading an article recently about the PTSD tsunami that we're likely to see as a result of COVID. And PTSD impacts the brain in various ways. So there's reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is where we think logically, reduced activity in the hippocampus, long-term memory lives there, and hyperactive response in the amygdala, which processes fear. Can you walk me through the process of how PTSD impacts the brain and how MDMA also interacts with that?
Yeah, so I guess one of the veterans that was in our study, our phase 2 study for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, said, PTSD changed my brain and MDMA changed it back. All right, so the factors that you have just discussed in the brain, the hyperactive amygdala, the reduction of activity in the prefrontal cortex, the reduction of connectivity with the hippocampus, so that what you have is these traumatic memories that actually themselves are rewiring the brain. You end up having more activity in certain areas. You can have more neural connective, certain kind of pathways, certain sounds that might remind one of something that was in battle or something like that. The fact that the logical part of the brain is diminished in activity, there's not a lot of processing to say that's just a car backfire, or that's just a door slam, or I'm not in a situation where there's bombs falling or guns firing. So we have people that end up where the past has so subsumed the present. The present is, you're not living in the present, you're living in the past. You're living with this sense that the trauma is about to happen again, or is still happening, or you're always on guard, or you can. So what MDMA does, and I'm not to say that this is only from MDMA, you can get this from really good psychotherapy. Sometimes people need more than psychotherapy. That's what we have proved in our research, that some people can get better from psychotherapy, but a lot of people, it's too painful, their memories, they need some help. So the MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala, so that it really has this ability to help people to have these fearful memories without the fearful emotions. Also, MDMA enhances people's activity in the prefrontal cortex. So we are more logical. We can tell ourselves a different story. And at the same time, there's more connectivity between the amygdala and the hippocampus, so that these memories from the past that have never been fully processed and put into long-term storage can now be put into long-term storage, so that they're happening then, but not now. And there's a whole process of fear extinction and memory reconsolidation. What that means is that when you can extinguish the fear of certain kind of memories, then when you reconsolidate the memory, when you put it back, you are swapping out the new emotion with the old emotion. So we see people's memory for the trauma is enhanced. They have a better sense of what actually happened to them. But when they remember it again after the therapy, they remember that they had processed it, it's in the past. The other thing that MDMA does that's, I think, very important to notice is the release of oxytocin. And oxytocin is the love hormone, the nursing mothers, when people are in love, and it's something that permits self-acceptance, self-love. So while you have all of this reduction in fear about difficult emotions, what MDMA does is it helps people to accept themselves. So if I had to, condense what MDMA does, it's self-acceptance. And because you are accepting yourself, you can look at your flaws, or you can listen to people share with you their opinions on you. That's why it's so good for couples therapy, because you're not so defensive. Your sense of self is not so vulnerable. You've accepted yourself, that you have this sort of self-love, self-compassion. And I think that's a key part of what MDMA does. And there's been a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins, Doblin, who has done studies in mice and shown that MDMA produces release of oxytocin in mice. But it doesn't end there. It produces new neural connections. And so you are actually helping to rewire your brain. You can. And that's where the importance of the integration afterwards. You can have these experiences and start a process, but if you don't try to reinforce it after the drug is gone, it might just fade. But if you have both the preparation, the experience, and the integration, then you can make these really long-term changes with a relatively short-term intervention.
Do you think that self-acceptance is largely due to a new story that you're telling about yourself?
No, I don't think so. I think that the self-acceptance is more biologically mediated. And then once you have the self-acceptance, then you can tell a new story. So here, I'll give you an example. And this is just such a good example, which was one of the vets in our study was back from Iraq, had terrible PTSD. And the story was that the warrior self from Iraq, when he came back, that he had to put it in a cage. That this was, and his problem was rage. He had problems with very quick rage. He never beat up his wife, but he threw things, and he had this problem with rage. So under the influence of MDMA, he was able to say to himself, and do this in imagery and metaphor. And so while his eyes are closed, listening to music, he's having this sense that there's this gorilla type with blood red eyes, evil eyes, locked in a cage inside him, and that's this part of himself. And that he realized that he didn't trust what that part of him could do from what happened in Iraq, but that he wasn't making it any better by keeping this in a cage. So they had all these images of this gorilla reaching through the bars of the cage, stabbing him with a knife in the side. He would take the knife out, and then he would unlock the cage, and then he would make friends with this part of himself. And that was the new story, that he could negotiate, in a sense, with these split off parts of himself, and that he could re-embrace them. And that was his first MDMA session, and he never had a problem with rage again. He still had other work to do to get over PTSD fully. But I think that this self-acceptance comes first, and then comes the new story.
And the self-acceptance, you say, is due to the biological effect, so the impact that MDMA can have on the brain, which can allow that new story to come through after.
Yeah, and once the MDMA is gone, once you've got this new story, it can sustain, it can persist, it can be durable. Another example is just, which I told during my TED Talk, but I think it's worth repeating, just in this idea of a new story. Another veteran, very much debilitated for like 6-7 years with PTSD, couldn't do anything. And under MDMA, he realized that the suffering that he was going through had a positive side, which is that was the way in which he showed loyalty, the way he honored his friends who had died, because he was sad about it. All right, but then under the influence of MDMA, he was thinking about his friends who had died, and then he was able to make this transition to being inside their heads, looking at him. So now he's at his dead friend's eyes, looking out at the world through his dead friend's eyes, and seeing himself, and realizing that they were unable to live. They would not want him to squander his life by suffering perpetually and being unable to function. And he said, there's a new way for me to honor my friends, which is to move forward and live as fully as I can. They can live through me. They don't. And so that was that quick story that I'm honoring my friends. There's a different way to do it. And then he said, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And then he also realized that he was using opiates for pain. And he said, I don't think I need these opiates anymore. And I'm not so sure I'm using them for pain. I'm using them for escape. And he said, I don't need drugs anymore. And he dropped out of the study after one session. And that's about, I just heard from him a week ago. That's almost 8, 9 years ago. And he's fine. And he hasn't done more MDMA. And so it was that story. But I think it came from, yes, the power of MDMA to help him see things in a different way so that he could rewrite his life story.
There have been various healing circles in other cultures for thousands of years, shamans using ayahuasca. Many of these shamanic rituals are done in a group setting. Have you done any research on the impacts of MDMA therapy in a group setting? And is that at all, do you see any potential in that?
The reason I'm laughing is that we've done research at Burning Man. We've done research at my college, where we'd have all night dance parties. So informally, we have done all sorts of group work, but formally, and I don't mean MAPS, this was other ways, but I think what you're pointing to is super important, so that we are now in the process of designing group therapy studies. We're working with a Dr. Christopher, who was at UC San Francisco, worked with individuals with MDMA for PTSD. Now he's at Portland, Oregon VA. And so we're working with him on a protocol for a group therapy study. What I've learned about some of the group therapy treatment programs that the veterans have been offered is that they often have individual sessions where they talk about the specific trauma, and then the groups are about talking about your diet, talking about exercise, talking about different things, but they have reserved the psychotherapy about the actual trauma for individual sessions. So we would like to see, are there ways to sort of combine these approaches? So the protocol that we're thinking of for group therapy, which again, when you do this stuff with FDA, with people with severe PTSD, you have to start in a very cautious way. So we would have to start with group preparation, what's going on. Then we would have individual preparation. Then we would have an individual session. Then we would have individual integration. Then we have group integration. Then we have group preparation and a group session. And then we have group integration. So that's going to be how we would start it. Now, one part, and I think it's so important what you talked about before about the story. So you need to rewrite your story. And so what we see in a lot of the MDMA individual therapy is they have these experiences, and then when they talk to the therapists, they're rewriting their story. And a lot of the story comes from the quiet times when they're having their own inner experience. And that's where they're rewriting the story. And then it gets reinforced when they tell the therapists. My concern is that when we have group therapy, it may very well be that people have less time to rewrite their story. You're in a more social setting. So you're not necessarily doing this kind of deep rewriting your personal story. So even when we have a group setting, it may be that for the first couple hours, people are eyes closed listening to music, and then later they're interacting with each other. So I think that the financial pressure that we're going to get to make this affordable to more people, group therapy is one of the main ways that we're going to try to explore to do that. And there are certain things where group therapy might even potentially be more effective. When you see a group of people are struggling with the same thing you're struggling with, maybe that can help you not feel so isolated and alone. but I am concerned that the group therapy setting may not be quite as good as the individual setting. But if the group setting is 80% as good, but 20% the cost, then that's the way to roll it out. And then those individuals that need more could have one individual session or something like that.
Are you doing any active studies on combining MDMA therapy with other modalities like EMDR?
Yeah. So far, no, not with EMDR. But so what we do is, drug development research. MAPS does science, but I like to say that we actually do political science. Meaning that we have to be very strategic about what we do. And so a part of that strategy was to look at those people that have developed other non-drug psychotherapies for PTSD, particularly those that are connected with the Veterans Administration, but world experts all over the world on PTSD, and then approach them. And instead of saying, oh, what you've got helps a certain people, but it's limited and MDMA is better, what we've said to them is, we want you to learn about MDMA. We have a method that's our treatment method. It's manualized. You go to the MAPS website, you can get our treatment manual, describes our method. But we've gone to people that have developed prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy, in particular, cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, where it's two people, one has PTSD, it affects the relationship. And we have offered to fund studies that would pay them to do research blending MDMA with their existing non-drug psychotherapies. So that is, we've completed this study with MDMA with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. That was just a small treatment development study. It worked great. And now they're trying to do fundraise and get ready to do a larger controlled study. We're also very close. If COVID wouldn't have happened, we would have started studies blending MDMA with prolonged exposure and also with cognitive processing therapy. There is a whole group of studies that are what we're calling not MAPS sponsored studies, but IITs, which stands for investigator initiated trials. And there's an old friend of mine Kate Hawk, who is interested in blending MDMA with EMDR. There's one sort of story I'll say on this, though, is that Edna Foa, who developed prolonged exposure, 2009, we were at a conference together with Michael Mithofer, our lead psychiatrist, and myself, and we were telling her about MDMA. And she said, MDMA is dynamite in the brain, neurotoxicity, blah, blah, blah. I want nothing to do with it. And then she said, forget about it. Virtual reality will be better. So at the conference, there was Skip Rizzo, who is an expert in VR for PTSD, funded by the military. I went over to him and I said, Edna says MDMA is terrible. We should look at VR. And he just started laughing. And he said, if you have MDMA, you don't need VR. Okay, now Edna Foa is working with us. She has now come around and she's going to do a study with MDMA blending with prolonged exposure.
Can you just back up? What is prolonged exposure?
So prolonged exposure is this idea that if you are scared of something, if you repeat over and over what happened, eventually you get desensitized to it. So if you tell your story 100 times, the theory is that it no longer triggers you as much. However, there's a high dropout rate. A lot of people find it re-traumatizing. So prolonged exposure just means you expose people to the trauma story over and over and over. They have homework. They have to do it every night. This whole kind of situation. Cognitive processing therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy are not so much on exposing people to the trauma, but it's like what triggers you and can you logically separate out that this isn't something that needs to trigger you, or how do you handle anxiety? What different ways can you? So there's different therapeutic approaches. And I think that what we found, at least with the cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, is that the exercises that you do in that, they're really pretty good, and that you can do them before as preparation, as part of integration. But it's turning out that the actual MDMA session is looking more and more like our inner-directed session without scripted. Let people go wherever they go, whatever they want to talk about. Let them decide how much time they spend eyes closed listening to music, when they talk to the therapists. It's sort of they lead and we follow. That's why we don't use the word that the therapists are not guides. It implies that the therapists know where to go. Very briefly to illustrate that, there was another Israeli who was part of had PTSD, and the issue was that a bunch of his fellow soldiers had gotten killed. All right, and so as it turned out, as that was coming up, he said, but they were really helpless. They were killed in their sleeping bags by an infiltrator, and they were helpless. And then he switched to, when I was young, my father used to beat me up, and I felt helpless. And so that was the original trauma. And then the later trauma was hard for him to process because it linked to this earlier trauma. But we could never have predicted that. That was something that he ended up bringing forth. And that also just suggests why VR is a challenge, because how do you know internally? You could have a VR story of this is what the war was like, and you could turn it on and off. But this move towards my childhood trauma underlying this other trauma, it's hard to predict that. So,
right. Correct me if I'm wrong on anything I'm about to say. My understanding is that MDMA is not patentable. MAPS has the exclusive rights to do these experiments currently. Is that correct?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
No. So data exclusivity is a different thing.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll explain. So MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912. And they didn't know what they had. They weren't trying to they were trying to evade a competitor's patent for something else. They had a whole synthetic pathway. They patented MDMA. So the composition of matter patent is in the public domain. Then you can have use patents. And so we actually hired patent attorneys to help us develop an anti-patent strategy. So we make it public. There's stories about MDMA used for all different things. One example, MDMA for postpartum depression. Not a lot of people have thought about that, but there have been people that have used it for that. And we have a whole protocol, people interested, and that's now up on our website. So we have an anti-patent strategy for use patents. Then there's what's called process patents. So you can have a patent on the process for making the drug. We have unique IP, intellectual property, on how we made MDMA in commercial quantities, GMP, all this kind of stuff. We're going to make that public. We're not going to try to get use patents to block anybody else or anything like that. So what that meant was, at least for the first 28 years or so of MAPS, I thought that once it was a medicine, it becomes generic immediately. So it was around 2013 where I learned from a patent attorney that President Reagan signed a bill in 1984 to provide incentives for developing drugs that were off patent. And those incentives are data exclusivity. So what that means is, if we succeed in making a medicine out of MDMA and we generate all this data for safety and efficacy, FDA and other regulatory agencies say, yes, you can market it. Data exclusivity means nobody could use our data to market a generic, and it will end up being for 6 years, 10 years in Europe. But other people, if they wanted, other companies, Merck, let's say Merck is like, you stole our drug, and we invented it. They could make MDMA into a medicine, but they'd have to generate their own data. So that's why we don't have exclusive use of MDMA or exclusive research with MDMA, nothing like that. But if we present the data for safety and efficacy that's used by regulatory agencies to approve the drug for marketing, then we have exclusive use of that data.
There are companies like Atai Life Sciences that are working on patentable derivatives of MDMA.
Yeah.
Do you see any issues moving forward with companies patenting derivatives for various uses?
No. If they invent something new, it's totally within their right to patent it. And if they then want to make it into a medicine. So yesterday, there's two companies, Atai and Tactogen. So Tactogen was one of the co-founders of it is Matt Baggett, who's an old friend of mine from 30 plus years ago. We were together just the other day on Zoom, of course. And what I was saying to him is that, we'd had a meeting with, so we now have a director of commercialization, and we're trying to figure out, what money we might make from the sale of MDMA and how do we do that. And all the money, at present will just go to the mission of MAPS. We don't have any investors, 100% nonprofit owns the benefit corporation. But in terms of our commercialization plans, the question was, what are some of the risks? And so I was saying, well, one of the risks is, at least for our income stream, is that Tactogen or Atai comes up with a better molecule than MDMA. And then people gravitate to that. And I said, we might normally look upon that as a risk, but that would be fine if they do that, because what is our real goal? And this gets back to the very discussion at the beginning. The real goal is mass mental health. And if we have, we can take credit if we have helped open the field and moved MDMA through the system, and now it's motivated for-profit people to make all this investments to come up with a better drug than MDMA, all to the better. I don't see it as a risk. On the other hand, I don't know that they're going to do it. I think, there's 4-MMC, there's methylone, there's all these drugs that are kind of similar to MDMA. I've tried several of them and I liked them a lot. I don't think they're quite as good as MDMA, but maybe they'll improve on MDMA, or maybe they'll get a shorter acting. Take MDMA and it's only 2 hours, and now we can fit it into more of a traditional therapy setting. So I am in favor of those companies, and if they want to patent their drugs that they've invented, there's nothing wrong with that.
What do you see as the main risks or roadblocks to your work becoming available to the masses?
Insurance coverage. It's expensive. It's initially expensive because you can give somebody a prescription for SSRIs that are not that expensive, but then they don't get that much help. They have side effects. Often they take it for 10, 20 years. But for MDMA therapy, because it's therapy, there's going to be an initial expense at the beginning that's larger than just giving somebody drugs, or than having them go to a therapist once a week for the next year or so. So it's about 42 hours of therapy that we have in our program. And that's 3 MDMA sessions, 8 hours long, and 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapists. And we use a 2-person therapy team. We have a meeting this Friday coming up with FDA about the credentials of the therapists. We want one of them to be licensed as a therapist. The second person, we would like to be an apprentice or a student, getting hours to be a therapist, or not even becoming a therapist, but working at substantially less money than the first person. So we want to keep the 2-person team if we can. So I think insurance coverage is the biggest, because what we have seen is that in the last 4 years, one of the very few things that has gotten bipartisan support has been criminal justice system reform. There is a lot less zeal for the drug war than there used to be. There's a recognition of how racist it is, and mass incarceration, and we see that all the time. So that has been the big problem in the past, that you medicalize psychedelics, and the drug war is sustained on demonizing drugs and demonizing drug users. And now that's what we saw with medical marijuana. All the resistance to medical marijuana was the drug warriors didn't want people to say good things about marijuana because it's supposed to be this terrible drug and you should be going to jail for it. And so the kind of drug war ideology I don't see it as a big barrier anymore. It's still a problem, but it's not as big as it used to be. For widespread adoption, I think that the FDA is still going to be putting science first, data first, over drug war politics, which is diminishing. So for mass acceptance as a medicine is insurance coverage. But on the other hand, and again, we're a rare nonprofit or a rare psychedelic research company in that we are for drug policy reform at the same time as we are for drug development. So we want people to be able to have access to MDMA without having to get it from us. We want licensed legalization system, and we want people to be able to get educated, to have pure drugs, honest education, harm reduction policies, and treatment on demand if they need it, paid for by the taxes from all these people buying the drugs and using them well. or in a few cases, not so well. So I really think that widespread adoption is going to be limited on the one hand by whether there's insurance coverage for the treatment, but we're trying to also address that through drug policy reform, having people be able to get it on their own and do it themselves in groups, as we talked about, in party settings, recreational settings, festival settings, or just groups of friends. So our Zendo project, which is psychedelic harm reduction, we're expanding that now to train more and more people about how to offer peer support for people having difficult psychedelic experiences. We're also doing that for first responders. We have a contract now with the city of Denver to train some of their first responders in Zendo harm reduction, because Denver has made mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. And so if they encounter people with difficult mushroom trip, we want them to not tranquilize them, not taser them, not arrest them, not tranquilize them, but, refer them to some other people that can handle them, and within a very short amount of time, a lot of times panic reactions can turn into really productive therapy settings.
I agree. I think that the culture and the timing and the funding is all in a very special place right now that we didn't have in the 1960s. I've heard Michael Pollan say on Tim Ferriss's podcast that he believes that carelessness is the great threat moving forward.
I don't see that as much because we have had, carelessness is a problem, right? But there are and will continue to be careless people. What I think why it's not such a problem anymore is that we've been able to successfully educate people to say that our controlled environments in a therapeutic setting are fundamentally different than recreational settings. And that the risks in these recreational settings of people who are using these drugs, maybe they're not pure drugs, maybe they're using them mixed with other things, maybe they're drinking alcohol, maybe they're just looking for a good time and they're not prepared when difficult stuff comes up. So I think careless use is not going to derail the drug development.
All right. Last one, I want to just circle it back. You've been knocking this out of the park and so generous with your time, man. What impact has...
I love mud water, I should just say.
You love mud water?
Well, I don't like it because I don't drink coffee or anything like that, but my kids love it.
That's great. Well, we love what you're doing and are happy to be a part of it. We'll keep sending it to your kids.
They would love it. Yeah, they think it's great. I was really, yeah. They were like, "Yeah, this is one of the good things about you, doing your work. You're getting some free mud water."
Arguably, the best part of the whole development of MAPS was free mud water for your kids.
They would. Well, I don't think they would agree with that, but they would pick up there pretty high.
Right. When I interview people on this podcast who are doing big work out in the world, I often wonder if they had some kind of vision early on. And often there's a kind of humility where it's just like, I had no idea that this was ever going to turn into it. I never could have expected it. But when you said what you said at the beginning of our conversation struck me, which was that you decided to be a draft dodger because you
didn't dodge the draft.
or a draft resistor.
Yes.
What you told me was you decided to become a draft resistor because it would have the biggest impact on the system. So you didn't do it from this place of thoughtlessness. You did it from a very strategic place. And I see the work that you've done throughout your life as highly strategic, from the way that you're working with the FDA to beginning with veterans for bipartisan support. When you were younger, did you have any kind of vision of this whole system and the way that your life would turn out?
Well, I would say no. What I had was, as I was growing up, I had a series of I had very liberal politically active parents. And that was a key point. I had also been, they were financially successful, as was my grandfather, and they told me that they would support me in doing whatever I wanted to do. But the other part of it is that I had been raised from an early age in stories of the Holocaust and just the irrational factors and how they, often take over rationality and could end up being my demise. No matter how financially secure you are, you could still be killed by these sorts of things. So I was kind of further traumatized by, the Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam and all this. So I was raised to be political and to look at deeper threats. And so I felt my parents didn't drink. I believed the propaganda about drugs. So for almost my up until the time that I was 16 and 17, I believed the drug war propaganda. And when I first started, and so most of my early childhood was trying to think about how do we deal with this demonization of others, the dehumanization, the prejudice, the irrational factors. How do we deal with that? I was given sort of the privilege from generations before me of grandparents and great-grandparents being refugees, coming to America, and then the American dream and making it successful. And so I was given the privilege to look at deeper threats. And I just thought that, what am I going to do with my life? And so when I first started taking psychedelics, and I got this intimation beyond ego, that this sense of unity and connection, that I thought this is the antidote to genocide, to fundamentalism, to prejudice. And then was the whole situation with Vietnam. So I just thought, I'm going to focus on the best idea that I can have. It may be long-term strategy, but we need mass mental health, and psychedelics are a tool to that. And I could be an underground therapist. I never thought of, I'm going to start a nonprofit pharmaceutical company, or, all of that just came out of necessity as time developed. And so it's been kind of shocking, where we're at now with over 100 people. We've raised over $100 million in donations. We're on the verge of a couple of years. We hope to get FDA approval. We're trying to globalize. But no, when I was younger, I just thought, the vision I had was, I had a dream of a Holocaust survivor telling me that he wanted me to be a psychedelic researcher and therapist. And so that's been the animated, that this is the best response I can think of to genocide and the Holocaust, or to irrationality taking over.
Did you journal any of those ideas?
I did. I actually found some of the journals that I had when I was 18, around that period of time. I don't now. Now I just do emails.
Did you keep those journals?
I found them. Yeah, I found them. Well, my mom just died in August. My father had died 2 years ago. And so we went through the house, and they had saved all these things. And so there was my journals.
Did anything strike you when you went back and read your journals from when you were 18 and came up with these initial ideas?
Yeah, I was like, well, I thought, wow, that makes sense. Even now, I thought, wow, how did you come up with those things? You were just a young kid. Pretty good.
Hell yeah, man. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to say? Any last shout outs to the MUD community?
Yeah, I would just say that we're trying to build up Team Psychedelics. And so we have had a major donor strategy. We've needed to have such large amounts of money, but we have not focused on building the base. You could say building the member. So we are now in a situation where we're trying to go from roughly 3,000 donors per year to 10 or 15 more. So I would just encourage people to, if they're open to supporting this, come to the MAPS website and become a member. And it's $50 or different ways to do it. But we really want to build the community, and then we want to spread information about appropriate use of psychedelics so that we can really succeed this time in integrating psychedelics, not have a backlash. And I think, reckless, dangerous, irresponsible use is a problem. I don't think but it's a problem for wider social acceptance. So the more people could join with us and learn and be supports for their friends. That's what we need.
Well, I just became a donor and signed up to go through a Zendo training.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Wow, that's terrific.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to it. And if you and your kids ever make it out to Santa Cruz, where I'm based, everyone on the podcast gets a free surf lesson. So we've got everything to push you into some baby little waves if maybe that's the next chapter in Rick Doblin's life.
Well, actually, Santa Cruz is where I did try to surf before and found, wow, this is hard.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually went to junior high right across the street from MAPS at Mission Hill Junior High.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Small world.
Yeah.
Rick, thank you so much, man. This was just a pleasure.
For me too, Kyle. Okay, and I do have to go to another meeting, but it's really great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
See you.